Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. The Los Angeles Air Force Base is, of course, significant to our local economy, but more importantly, the United States Space Force is vital to our national security. We are privileged to have one of the key members of that organization, Colonel Mia Walsh, the commander of Space Base Delta III. She will share with us today some insights into the mission and purpose of this vital installation. Let's welcome Colonel Mia Walsh.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Colonel Mia Walsh, and like Cindy said, I'm the commander of Space Base Delta III, which does not roll off the tongue. It's basically saying that I'm the installation commander for Los Angeles Air Force Base. So Space Base Delta I is Peterson and Schriever in Colorado. Space Base Delta II is Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado. We're Space Base Delta III, and then we have Space Launch Delta 30 and 45, Patrick and Vandenberg. It is an honor to be here today with all of you to talk about the Space Force, and I'd especially like to thank Cindy for the invitation. Thank you so much for having me. I got to see a little bit of the museum, so hopefully you all did too. It's really amazing, and I'm really thankful that we're putting such a highlight on women in aerospace. So before I start talking about the Space Force, I thought I'd talk a little bit about my career in the Space Air Force and now the Space Force. I thought that would help cage kind of the discussion of where I'm going with where the Space Force is going. Okay, so I started my career at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. I was a ICBM, so a Missile Combat Crew Commander. The reason I bring that up is it's important for three reasons. This is my first base. I'm from Hawaii and I moved to Wyoming. But I had really great leadership there, and I think the value of having great leadership as your first assignment in the military is it gives you kind of an idea of what kind of leader you want to be in the future, and it also helps you find your place in the military. So I also learned, because I was in nuclear weapons, I learned about the importance of training and also the importance of discipline, which is really important when you're working with nuclear weapons. The second important thing about being at F.E. Warren is that I was on alert for 9/11. So it just so happened that I was out in the field that morning. My crew partner woke me up. I'd just gone to bed probably around 5 in Mountain Time, and he woke me up and said, "Hey, I think you might want to get out of bed." And I thought, okay, we must be having some kind of maintenance in the capsule or something like that. And then he showed me what was happening on CNN. That's important because that has kind of shaped where I've gone in my career and the things that the US military has been focused on as far as threats. The third important thing about being at F.E. Warren is that I met my husband there. So he's retired security forces. He works at the Pentagon in DC. We have 2 children, a 17-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son, and they're both back in DC as well. So they stayed there while I took this assignment. I went from F.E. Warren Air Force Base, Wyoming, to Florida. So my husband and I, since we got married at F.E. Warren, we kind of did the you pick, I pick as far as tours go. You pick, I pick, you pick, I pick. So I said, well, I sacrificed and went to Florida with you. That was his choice. So the Eglin radar, that's the picture on the left. It is the most powerful radar in the world. It was the world's first large phased array radar. Like other radars built in that time in the 1960s, it was built to track nuclear missiles and to protect us from give us ample warning time for incoming missiles. It's a really amazing radar. It tracks about 200 objects simultaneously, and it can track at near Earth, so kind of the lower Earth orbits, it can track the size of a baseball. And in deep space, about 22,000 nautical miles, it can track an object the size of a basketball. It's really powerful. It is so powerful, actually, that when the shuttle used to land at Cape Canaveral, we'd have to turn the radar power down. And if planes fly over the Eglin Range, which they do frequently, we turn the radar off, just for the safety of the pilots. It was at that site that I learned a lot about space domain awareness, which we'll be talking about more later today. So from Florida, I went on to Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, and I worked in the 21st Operations Group, and at that time, that was the largest group in Air Force Space Command. Is responsible for space domain awareness. And then I worked on staff, traveling to all the space surveillance network sites to do certification and check their training programs. So if you look at this picture, these is showing all the network of sensors around the world. These are the sensors that detect, track, catalog, and identify all space objects. So it was born kind of out of a formalized US effort to catalog satellites as we entered the space race. I'll ask a question. Does anybody know what the first object was to be cataloged? Sputnik. So a lot of people say Sputnik. But if you think about the cataloging effort, it's always the first thing that goes up. So actually Sputnik is number 2, and the launch body that launched it was number 1. So the satellite control network can predict when a decaying object will re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. It can prevent a returning space object from triggering a false alarm for missile warning sensors, which is important not just for the US, but also for other countries. It can chart the present position of space objects, and it also plots their anticipated orbital path, and that produces the satellite catalog. It can detect new artificial objects in space, and most importantly, we inform NASA whether there are any conjunctions with the International Space Station. So that's to ensure safety of human spaceflight for the astronauts aboard that space station. From the Space Surveillance Network, I went to school at Maxwell and then to the Pentagon, and I worked in missile defense, and then I went just up the road to Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And that when I worked there, I was a squadron commander for the 18th Space Control Squadron. It's now the Space Defense Squadron. And it's existed for a long time in various forms, but it basically does command and control for all space domain awareness. So it's the lead for the Space Surveillance Network. It's basically the unit that compiles all the data coming in from all the sensors around the world and publishes the satellite catalog. So we work with the United Nations to publish that catalog. That catalog is published for free on spacetrack.org, so anybody, any country, any person can register for an account and see where space objects are located. The amazing thing about that squadron is that we basically provide this service for free to the world. So say if a country did a launch like India and they can't find their satellite because say it didn't make orbit, they call us. So that happened when I was there. If China can't find their satellite, they will call us to say what's the latest data that you got on your satellite, or they'll pull that data from spacetrack.org. So in addition to the satellite catalog, we also provide what's called conjunction assessment. So like I said, we track the objects in space, and if they're going to collide, we let either countries or companies, whoever owns the satellite, know that that there could be an impending collision, and that way they can decide whether they're going to maneuver or not. So we don't tell them whether to maneuver or not. We just give them the data and let them know. This is an amazing assignment. I got to work very closely with NASA as well, like I said, on the International Space Station to ensure that the astronauts were protected. So, and then from there, I went back to DC. I went to school again. The Air Force likes sending people to school. And then I went to and worked in the National Military Command Center for General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And then I came here to LA last summer, so it's beautiful here. Not super fond of the traffic, but, and I came from DC, but I love it here, it's great. And the community of people that we have, in the whole entire South Bay area, but especially in El Segundo and in San Pedro are just amazing, really great people. So I've been on active duty for about 24 years, and when you talk about my career, most of that time was spent in the Air Force, doing space operations, and then a couple years ago when the Space Force stood up, I transferred over to the Space Force. So a lot of people will do either depth or breadth across their career, so they might have an opportunity to do satellite command and control or launch, but from what I've told you, I've mostly stayed in the space domain awareness realm and tracking satellites. So this used to be a fairly minor mission for the Air Force, but it's now a pretty significant mission. When I came into the Air Force in 1998, there were about 9,000 objects in space being tracked. Today, there are about 48,000 objects. So that includes active and inactive satellites, space probes, and other debris. So debris especially has really grown a lot, from about 6,000 objects in 1998 to over 40,000 objects today. Okay, so let's move on to talking about the Space Force. A lot of you may be wondering, what is the Space Force? So it's the newest service. We just had our 3rd birthday this past December. I see a lot of veterans in the audience. I took a lot of ribbing on the Joint Staff from the Marines and the Navy and the Army. They were like, happy 2nd birthday. I was like, thank you. So just as the Marines fall into the Department of the Navy, the Space Force falls into the Department of the Air Force. And although we are a new service, you can really look at it more as a reorganization of our nation's space assets under the one service. So we've been doing space operations for decades, and some of those assets fell into the Army, things like satellite communications or SATCOM or missile defense. Some fell into the Navy, like reconnaissance satellites, or also they did a lot of satellite communications. And the rest of it fell under the Air Force. So that includes everything from space tracking to space launch, to satellite command and control, to electronic warfare, to missile warning. And creating a new service, creating the Space Force, brought those assets all under one service, and we're still working consolidation efforts, but it kind of ensures a more lean and agile force. So while we can now think of space as a warfighting domain, we should also think conversely, what's a day without space? So when you think of other services fighting a war on land or sea or air, a lot of times they can do so without affecting our day-to-day life, depending, of course, on the location of the battle. Space is a completely different domain. So nearly everyone in the US utilizes the benefits of space assets every day through things like GPS, the Global Positioning Satellite System, or cell phones, or TV, satellite TV, or even weather reporting. However, we also use it for things that you may not think about as regularly, like the supply of electricity. That would be interrupted because the timing of the supply of electricity is done through GPS. There would be no air transport because that's done through GPS. Without space assets, you can't get money from an ATM. The timing of that is also through GPS. You wouldn't be able to trade stocks. So losing our space systems would cause a global financial collapse, and that's why it's so important for us to ensure that we have assured access to space. I know this slide looks very complicated, so I'm going to take it step by step. So here is a look at our Space Force capabilities today. So across the bottom, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, that's our satellite control network. That's satellite control centers, tracking stations, and test facilities around the world. The satellite operation centers are linked to remote tracking stations that ensure the satellites are operating correctly and that they're in the correct orbit. And we maintain that frequent communication. So if you go right next to the satellite control network to the right, that's our space surveillance network, which I've already talked to you about. Those are the sites around the world that track space objects. To the right of that, you have the missile warning radars, like Eglin, built to track nuclear missiles originally, but now they also provide space domain awareness capabilities. They are located around the world, everywhere from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, to Beale, California, Cavalier, North Dakota, for the missiles coming over the poles from Russia, to Alaska, Greenland, and even the United Kingdom. So our allies are really important when we think about the space fight. Those are all placed for coverage of different areas to protect the US homeland. Then if you go over from the missile warning, you'll see the space electronic warfare assets like CCS. Those are counter communication systems. That's kind of a transportable electronic warfare system that can deny adversary capability. Basically, it's a jammer for satellites that we can use against our enemies. And then if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, those are showing some of the launch capabilities we have. Those are done at Vandenberg Space Force Base up on the coast, and Patrick Space Force Base in Florida. So if any of you, since you're so close here, if any of you have never driven up to Vandenberg to see a launch, I highly recommend it. You can see the launch schedules on Spaceflight Now or space.com, and you can see when those launches will go. It's pretty exciting for me. In 24 years I've been in, but it's still really exciting to see. The idea that, I guess for me, it's the idea that something could go wrong anywhere in that process, right? When you think about a satellite getting launched, something could go wrong all the way from the launch timing. Maybe the launch doesn't go correctly, the rocket doesn't work correctly. When it reaches up into orbit, that doesn't necessarily mean that the satellite will deploy correctly. Once the satellite deploys, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll reach its orbit correctly. And then it has to communicate back down to Earth. So when you think about all the things that can go wrong, to me, it's just really amazing that we can put satellites up and that we can have successful launches. Okay, so let's look at our orbits. If you look from the top down, our geostationary orbit, that provides kind of the best continuous Earth coverage, because if you think about how high it is and it kind of sits in that orbit looking at one spot on the Earth, it's great for communications and it's great for Earth viewing. Then if you think about the medium Earth orbit, that's where our GPS satellites sit, and those are the satellites that are sitting under position navigation and timing. And then low Earth orbit, which is really optimal for Earth sensing, even though it can only see a small portion of the Earth because it's so low. This is where the Starlink satellites are located. Does everybody know about the Starlinks? This is not a DoD program, but still very exciting. So Starlink satellites were launched by SpaceX. They provide satellite internet access coverage to over 50 countries, many of whom who really would not have any connection to the internet without Starlink. So right now there are about 3,580 Starlink satellites up in low Earth orbit. They launch about 50 to 60 at a time. They kind of flick off this, as they launch, which is really amazing. The plan is for about 12,000 satellites total, so covering low Earth orbit. And in December 2022, SpaceX actually reached 1 million subscribers to Starlink. And the reason why Starlink has kind of been in the news lately is because of the war in Ukraine. So when Russia cut off internet access for the Ukrainians, Elon Musk sent over a bunch of Starlink terminals so that the Ukrainians could still have internet access. So it's really amazing to think about not just what the Department of Defense or other militaries are doing in space, but what commercial companies are doing in space. Okay, so adversaries have really transformed the space domain. So this is kind of a look at how contested, congested, and competitive the domain is now. So while the first Gulf War was considered the first space war where space assets were readily and heavily used, the Cold War era is where we really saw the space domain transition into a contested environment. So in 1973, the Soviet Union declared their anti-satellite program operational. And this declaration put the onus back on the US, saying that, hey, our space assets are vulnerable up there. And after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, we did see a decrease in space threats until about the mid-2000s. So now let's look kind of towards that middle of the slide where the red circle is, with the Chinese ASAT test. So in 2007, the Chinese tested their own ASAT, anti-satellite program, when they destroyed a defunct weather satellite. This show of force did two things. The first, it proved that China was pursuing space dominance. The second is that it demonstrated their capability and willingness to employ kinetic capabilities to achieve those ends. So this test launched a missile from China, hit the old Chinese weather satellite, and to date, it created the largest debris spread in history in space. So more than 2,000 pieces of trackable sized debris that's golf ball size or larger, plus about 150,000 debris particles. So if any of you have seen, there's kind of a famous picture of the shuttle with a little tiny hole in the windshield. So when they came back and tested it, they discovered that it was a paint fleck traveling, through space that hit, and I think it went through 7 out of 9 of the windshield panes in the shuttle. So that's just the amount of damage that it can do. So since those pieces sit at about 530 miles above the Earth, they'll likely remain in orbit for decades, probably until about 2035. NASA is estimating that 30% of the debris will still exist. Now, why is this important? If you If you think about our responsibility in space, and when I talked about tracking of the debris, that's something that we do here. And while other countries have that capability, it's not nearly as robust as what the US has. So debris from Fyongyang-1 Charlie, that weather satellite, it still causes issues today. The space domain is made even more complex when you include the buildup and the congestion and the space domain task of managing not just those debris on orbit, but also all the active satellites up there. So countries that used to have a non-existent space program are all now building and launching their own space capabilities. So if you look just to the right of the red circle, and you'll see a little box that says Object E. So Object E was launched in 2013. It looked like, sometimes when you have a launch, there can be like a little debris piece that comes off. So that's why it was tagged Object E. It wasn't really tagged with the actual catalog number until it started maneuvering. So once we saw, so again, this is the squadron up at Vandenberg that saw, hey, what is that piece of space junk doing? It shouldn't be moving in that way. That's how we kind of knew that it was actually a satellite and not just debris. And then in May 2014, so this was December 2013, in May 2014, we had thought that there were 3 satellites, and then this Object E that came off, and Russia confirmed that they had launched 4 satellites. Next to that, you'll see Shijian-17. That was a Chinese satellite in GEO. It's really known for its unusual behavior. Public available orbital positioning data suggests that it makes several close approaches to our satellites that are in GEO, and it basically inspects them. So that satellite is also thought to be equipped with a robotic arm, which means that it could pull our satellites out of orbit. In 2017 and 2018, 3 small Russian satellites emerged in low Earth orbit. There was a statement of concern from the US State Department, and it's because the satellite launched, and then a little satellite popped out of it. So, and then a few months later, a 3rd satellite popped out of it. So it's kind of like a Russian nesting doll, if you think of that, but things that we just weren't expecting. So again, because the squadron and because the Air Force and now Space Force tracks and catalogs all those objects, we don't really have any idea what we're cataloging unless we share information, and we don't get that shared information from Russia. So all 3 spacecraft successfully conducted a series of maneuvers, including rendezvous proximity operations, which is going around other satellites, close approaches, and other things. In December 2019, they launched Shijian-20. China claimed it was a high throughput communication satellite, and they would help provide communication and internet services to countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. It is their heaviest satellite. It sits in GEO. It has a full wingspan of over 40 meters, so larger than a Boeing 737. Aside, kind of funny story, when I worked at the MAGCOM, at the Major Command and Air Force Space Command, they have satellite models hanging. And my husband came to visit the building, and he said, I did not realize the satellites are so big. It was a fairly large, probably, I guess, maybe 4 times the size of this, of the camera area. And I said, it was a Milstar satellite, and I said, that's a quarter scale model because the Milstar is the size of a bus. And she was amazed. Like the fact that we can launch something the size of a bus that then folds out, is pretty amazing. So in 2019, a Russian satellite, also an inspector satellite, began operating in proximity next to one of our key satellites. And it then exhibited behavior similar to the nesting doll satellite, where it itself released a projectile. So clearly, this kind of behavior in space is very concerning. In 2021, 2 other significant events impacted the space domain. The first is a hypersonic glide vehicle that's been in the news a lot. That one was performed by China, and it demonstrated a capability called fractional orbital bombardment. So basically bombs from space at hypersonic speeds. That demonstration challenges our missile warning and missile tracking radars that I showed you, and our missile defense systems, and it's a big reason that we need to pivot to more resilient and more capable architectures. The second thing that happened in 2021 is that Russia launched their own anti-satellite test. It's actually kind of interesting because when you think, so in the international community, when China did the ASAT test in 2007, there was a lot of pushback from the international community because space needs to be accessible to everyone, and that size of a debris field makes space complicated for everyone. So when when we heard that they might be doing this anti-satellite test, I was working in the National Military Command Center, and one of the generals asked me, "So Mia, you're the only space officer here. Do you think they'll launch this?" And I said, "No, it's so irresponsible, right? I think it's so irresponsible. I don't think they'll do it." So of course, a couple days later, they launched it, and he was like, "Mia, your credibility is completely shot as a space officer." So they destroyed one of their own satellites that had been in orbit since 1982, and that created a field of 1,500 trackable debris in low Earth orbit, and that also threatens space operations and human spaceflight. The destruction of inactive Russian satellite, it can also cause the 7 crew members aboard the International Space Station to have to take cover. So the squadron has kind of a hotline with NASA, and we will call them and let them know that there's a piece of debris that looks like it could impact the International Space Station. So those astronauts, at the time it was 4 Americans, 2 Russians, and a German, they had to take shelter in there's a little pod that they take shelter in. They seal off the modules for the space station so that they can be safe. So even though we monitor our potential adversary movements in space, our vision should encompass all the countries because we all use space and because any kind of war or debris or anything else in space will affect everybody who uses the domain. So that's not just the countries that put up space satellites, that's also companies, commercial companies, and that's also our allies. So this is kind of where the lower part of the chart comes into play with the buildup of the congestion in space domain. So right in the middle of the chart, I originally talked about all the debris in space, and the task of managing those 40,000 pieces on orbit becomes increasingly difficult to track and prevent collisions. So you may have seen in the news that the DoD is pushing a lot of that mission to the Department of Commerce, and they'll take over the mission of cataloging and tracking all the objects in space, and that will allow us to concentrate on the threats in space and the warfighting efforts. With all of the successes our space-based capabilities have brought to our nation and our allies, the spotlight has prompted other adversaries to watch, record, and wait for their own opportunities to try to attempt the same successes that we've had in space and to disrupt our own capabilities if they desire. So nations have gone to war over resources and territory, and space is just another resource. It's an infinitely larger territory that's critical to our strategic well-being, and not just when you think about in wartime, but also when you think about our civilian population. Countries with non-existent space programs are building and launching their own space capabilities, and that has resulted in more great power competition. So how are we getting after those threats? So we stood up the Space Force. It is a very highly diverse and skilled workforce. There are about 13,500 Guardians right now. And on the top left of the slide, if you look, we are actually 50% active duty military and 50% civilian. We'll be the only service that kind of remains with that split. Additionally, the Space Force is the first service that has a higher number of officers than enlisted. I'm sure this is very strange for a lot of you to hear. So if you think about the Army and how many younger enlisted they have, and then how that kind of whittles up as you go through the ranks, same for the Marine Corps, same for the Navy. The Space Force has a lot of officers. In the 2+ years since we've stood up, and a lot of members have come over from the Air Force, some have also come over from the Army and the Navy. By the end of the last fiscal year, there were 26 members that had never been in the Air Force and had transferred in from those other services. Or they came in as a direct ascension, because now we have Space Force BMT, and we also have a Space Force direct commissioning program. And we also commission people out of the service academies. These are some of the careers that are available in the Space Force. So LA Air Force Base is the acquisitions and engineering hub for the Space Force. That's where Space Systems Command is. I'm sure a lot of you may know the history of the Western Development Division and General Schriever being out here, and the history of all the great aerospace companies that work in this area and provide support and collaboration with LA Air Force Base. Then you have our cyber operators. Usually cyber in the Air Force is more of a IT type of program where they're making sure that we have access to email and other communications. Cyber for Guardians will be more of cyber warfare, working in cyberspace and seeing threats. Then we have our intel officers. So previously we shared intel officers with the Air Force, so you could do, say, an Air Force intel assignment and talk about planes or talk about the Middle East or other things. You could be an expert in different areas. And then maybe you came over and did a tour for space and worked space intel. Now we'll be growing our own space intel capability and have people that are focused solely on the threats that we see in space. And operations, which is what I do, and that again is anything from launch to missile track, missile warning, space domain awareness. Thank you so much. I hope this was interesting and you learned about the Space Force.